Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or whatever time it is from where you're joining us. We're still waiting for a few more people to join us, but I shall slowly begin. I'm Andreas Wunner. I'm associate professor at the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute here at Flinders University, and I would like to welcome you all to our seminar series on the future of work. I want to please alert you to the fact that this session is being recorded. Before we start, I would like to recognize that Flinders University operates on Indigenous peoples' traditional lands and waters, and that we acknowledge their continued responsibility to care for country at the university's various locations, which includes the lands and waters of the Kaurna people, from where I'm talking today. Today is our third installment of the 80 seminar series on the future of work in the digital age. In our previous two seminars, we had Dr. Navinda Koteje from CSIO Data 61 talk to us about advances in robotics in Australia, basically arguing that he sees new opportunities arising for the creation of collaboration between humans and robots, with the prospect of generating new jobs in the not so distant future. We also had Professor Hugh Bradlow, the president of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, talk to us about the promise of digitalization and automation. His main argument was that automation may not necessarily improve productivity, but reduce and possibly eliminate human error. In future presentations, we will explore the demand and need for training and skills in a future work environment, and also the social consequences and opportunities arising from how we may work and assign work in the future. And you can see details of this on our website, and those who've registered and for today's session will be sent invites to the next seminar. But today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Mark Dean, the Laurie Carmichael Distinguished Research Fellow at the Carmichael Centre at the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute. Mark is also an Adjunct Principal Research Fellow at RMIT University's Graduate School of Business and Law. And he's previously worked at the University of Adelaide and, in fact, at the Australian Industrial Transformation Institute here at Flinders University. He received his PhD in social sciences in 2018 and has since contributed to academic journals and edited books and produced reports on topics including advanced manufacturing industry policy, the future of work, Australian politics, economic theory, and trade union leadership. Mark's recently authored a report on the opportunities for developing an electric vehicles industry in Australia, and specifically South Australia. And today he will talk about this work. The title of his presentation is Charging Ahead, Electric Vehicles as Industrial Opportunity for South Australia. Mark, I believe, will argue for a more active industrial policy for manufacturing to build a sustainable and renewables-focused advanced industrial economy. Now, before I pass over to Mark, I just want to give a little bit of background on the role of electric vehicles and where we currently stand. Australia is an international laggard, I dare say, in developing an infrastructure for electric vehicles. And I don't just mean as in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of the service infrastructure that electric vehicles may require, and the maintenance infrastructure, of course, that the EVs may require. And that's on the assumption that electric vehicles will become more dominant and play a greater role. regardless of the zero emissions policy targets, which are still relatively far out as far as Australia is concerned in any case. But just to give you some statistics here, and my apologies to Mark if he intends to use some of these himself, but I thought as a context it's quite useful to position Australia where we are. In terms of new vehicle sales that included electric vehicles, in Norway, 75, 3/4 of new vehicle sales in the last few years were of electric vehicles. In Australia, we talked about 1.5%. Now, you may find the comparison with Norway is perhaps a bit unfair, but even if you take a look at the whole of Europe, where 1/10 of the cars sold in 2020, 2021 were electric vehicles, the gap is quite visible. In part, this may be a reflection of the lack of a production incentive for the automotive, or a sales incentive for the automotive industry in Australia, which, unlike Europe, has no emissions target. In Europe, car manufacturers have to meet certain emission targets for the aggregate sales of their vehicles, and that encourages a greater promotion of the sales and production of electric vehicles in those parts of the world. We don't have this here. We also have a little bit of a supply challenge in terms of the charging. What used to be the fuel stations, the petrol stations, are now becoming electric fuel or charging stations. There's still a huge gap in provision in this country. Surprisingly, perhaps, South Australia is one of the leaders in providing fuel charging stations in locations across the state. The challenge remains that most of these charging stations, about 90%, are slow charging stations rather than the fast charging stations. So unless you have half an hour to spare, charging your vehicle at a public charging station may be a little bit of a drawn-out affair. Here at the Tonsley Innovation District, where we are based, we have about six charging stations, but we also have, when the car parks gets full, about 600 vehicles is my best guess parked here. So there's still a lot of catching up to be done, a lot of development work required, but small things are happening in small steps. And perhaps being an international laggard in the electrical vehicle manufacturing sense is not necessarily a bad thing. Mark will tell us a little bit more about the opportunities that may exist out there for developing such an industry and moving from a laggard perhaps to a leader in EV production. Now, Mark will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. During this time, if you have any questions, can I encourage you to use the Q&A function on your screen? It's the function that looks like 2 chat bubbles. If you could use that, we'll be monitoring it, and we'll collect and read out your questions and let Mark answer as much as he can to the best of his ability those questions. When you're asking questions, if you wish to introduce yourself or your organizations, please do so. And on that note, I'll pass over to Mark.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you for having me today. Thank you to you and Gemma for this opportunity to participate in your seminar series. I'd like to first acknowledge the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you today. Pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge the Aboriginal elders of other communities that may be joining us remotely today. Today, my presentation will be on electric vehicles as an industrial opportunity for Australia. But briefly, I'd like to introduce the Carmichael Centre. The Carmichael Centre, based at the Centre for Future Work within the Australia Institute, honours and continues Laurie Carmichael's legacy. Laurie Carmichael was a legendary trade union leader in the Manufacturing Workers Union, previously the Metal Workers Union, as well as the Council of Trade Unions. And the aims of the Carmichael Centre are to develop and promote research on issues of importance to Australian workers, including industry policy, industrial relations, vocational education and training, industrial democracy, and social policy. And interestingly, as Andreas mentioned in his introduction, making comparisons between Australia and Norway and other Scandinavian countries is something that Laurie Carmichael was very passionate about, seeing those nations, their northern lights, their exemplary social and industrial policies as being things that Australia should aim for, and for unions to lead that. So that's very much what the Carmichael Centre is aiming to contribute to the policy debate, and that's the rationale for some of the arguments that I make in my presentation today. So my presentation will cover a bit about Australia's current EV policy landscape and some of the antecedents and precedents that have led to creating such a challenging environment for electric vehicle manufacturing industry in Australia, but what Australia's and South Australia's industrial advantages in this area might be. And then moving on to the building blocks of what an industry policy for an EV manufacturing sector in Australia should look like. And I'll focus a little bit on some potential opportunities for South Australia. And then concluding with a discussion about some ideas around how electric vehicles can form part of a broader climate policy, how they're only one pillar of a much broader transformation of our economy, and how South Australia might be able to take advantage of some of those opportunities. So, beginning with the EV policy landscape in Australia. Over the past several decades, Australian governments have gradually abandoned efforts to make strategic and forward-focused policy choices that can sustain and promote manufacturing in Australia. In place of deliberate strategic industry policy, such as coordinating public and private sectors to promote the qualitative development of Australia's economy in coordination, federal governments have focused instead on resource-based commodities. And this represents a policy strategy of comparative advantage. And this is a theory where those industries that reflect some kind of natural endowment or an attribute that a nation has naturally are favoured by policy and lead the nation's economic development and export orientation. And unfortunately, by this simplistic view, Australia's comparative advantage is very clearly in resource extraction. And I'll get to why that's a problem in a little while. Other advanced nations, on the other hand, have embraced a strategy of competitive advantage. So this is where they proactively favour industries that support greater and increasing economic returns in the long term. And this includes manufacturing, as investments in manufacturing maximise the quality and value added to processes and products for export to global markets. And in turn, value adding broadens the scope of economic complexity, which is the idea of promoting innovation and networking through diverse sectors of the economy to produce highly valuable products and services. And so with increasing economic complexity, a nation achieves not just economic growth, but also economic development. And that's an important distinction to make. And for this reason, manufacturing has implications for a nation's economic complexity. It's a measure of how well a nation can mobilise knowledge and technology to produce high-value, innovative products for export. And so when we look at what this means when we compare our exports and economic complexity to other nations, we often find Australia being in a fairly lackluster position. So this slide demonstrates Germany's economic complexity in 2019. And as you can see, it's a highly complex economy that exports a lot of high value services and products, including automobiles, other manufactured equipment, elaborately transformed manufactures, as well as high value services. And its exports in 2019 were worth $1.85 trillion. Oops. On the other hand, Australia in the same year, our exports were worth $329 billion, which is a very, very small fraction of Germany's comparative exports. And as we can see, coal and other fossil fuel exports make up a huge bulk of that export diversity or lack of diversity, as a matter of fact. And this is all can largely be explained by a long history of federal government policy that supports commodity exports at the expense of a strategic manufacturing policy. And this ranks Australia poorly in terms of economic complexity as a result. Unfortunately, despite occasional periods of high prices in global commodities, global commodity markets, the resulting reliance on extraction and export of non-renewable resources doesn't support the long-term economic growth and stability of Australia's economy. And as our global standing demonstrates, our economic complexity, which is around 87th, compared with the United States, Japan, and Germany, which are all placed well within the top 10 of nations in the world that have high economic complexity. And this explains why seizing sustainable industry opportunities in manufacturing represents Australia's best hope for a prosperous future. And here's another way of being able to see when we compare minerals and fuels exports with manufacturing exports, how comparative advantage policy orientation has been detrimental to our manufacturing exports. Since 2009, 2010, manufacturing share of GDP in the Australian economy has diminished significantly from above 8% to now less than 6%. And of course, there's been a long-term manufacturing decline since the 1980s, where it had a much larger share of GDP, with the deindustrialisation of Australia's economy since this time. And this is a problem because manufacturing is of critical importance to a nation's economic development. It's a huge demander of innovation, of research and development, a user and purchaser of technology, a developer of skilled workforces and high incomes, a source of massive productivity in the economy, and the reason why a lot of service industries exist as well, that form around these manufacturing clusters and provide services to them and throughout the broader economy. But importantly as well, it also promotes higher standards of living. So wages and productivity increase when we have robust manufacturing sectors that are producing high value and economically complex products for exports to other markets. And so left in the wake of deindustrialisation, we have a policy landscape which has diminished opportunities to, first of all, produce vehicles in Australia. And this is particularly a problem when we consider the growing electric vehicles industry globally. And we've also left ourselves with a very low base of electric vehicle uptake in Australia amongst consumers. So it's very difficult for governments to support EV ownership unless it's through tax mechanisms that penalise a lot of people. This is, and there's also been a lot of misinformation, such as the Prime Minister's lie that an EV can't tow a boat at the previous election, which he's since denied. But nevertheless, there's been a lot of disinformation about electric vehicles and what they're capable of. At the moment, states are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and there's a total absence of electric vehicle policy at the federal level. Altogether, this has contributed to the loss of historical capabilities, which has been happening in the process of deindustrialisation, particularly since the closure of Holden in 2017 as well. And so we're losing our capabilities to develop economic complexity through manufacturing industries. However, industry path dependence is a real factor here. So history matters. So what you were able to do in the past often determines what you're capable of doing in the future. And that puts you on a path to where you can identify your opportunities for creating economic complexity. We had a historically large manufacturing sector around automotive industries, and manufacturing can again become a strength if we hold on to what is left of it now without losing more of that capability in our economy. We used to make cars in Australia. We made them even before World War II. We made, of course, ICEs or internal combustion engine vehicles, but now obviously the imperative is to move to electric vehicles. And so Australia could seize upon its industrial advantages to capture a share of the growing global EV industry, but it can only successfully do this by establishing a strategic industrial policy for the transformation of our manufacturing industries and our broader economy. And so I've developed in a report from the Centre for Future Work, the Carmichael Centre, a report detailing what I think are 4 crucial building blocks for an EV industry policy. and why these are essential to develop our economy and ultimately address climate change in a responsible way, as every other industrial nation in the world is attempting to do by innovating and transforming its already advanced manufacturing industries. And so Australia's industry policy can be built on 4 key building blocks. First of all, our rich mineral reserves. Second, our advanced industrial base, as I've just mentioned. Third, our highly skilled workforce. And fourth, consumer interest in EVs, which also relates to the fact that Australians are very supportive of climate change action in government. So I'll move on to discussing and describing each of these 4 building blocks in the next section. Beginning with the first one, which is transforming Australia's resource industries. We're actually a major exporter of many of the minerals needed for electric vehicle batteries. So that includes lithium, cobalt, and nickel. And to look at, for example, at the value of lithium exports in 2017 through figures produced by the Future Batteries Industry Cooperative Research Centre, we exported $1.1 billion in 2017 of the raw lithium commodities that go into batteries. We exported them overseas and they were processed from our minerals in other countries to the tune of $22.1 billion. So we're looking at 10 times the value added that was produced overseas through Australian lithium commodities that we could have done here if we had a battery industry. So what this means is that we need to improve the export share of manufacturing through value adding to key minerals, including lithium, nickel, and cobalt, and process those minerals and manufacture batteries and battery components in Australia. This is a critical first step in transforming our existing primary industries and connecting them to our manufacturing sector. Where does South Australia fit into this supply chain and the developments we could see here? There is already minerals processing at Port Pirie, and recently the federal government announced a cobalt processing facility that will be established in Broken Hill. Considering that we have a lot of infrastructure, such as inland rail, we can really see that there are opportunities for South Australia to be part of this supply chain in terms of processing and adding value to resources, and being a major logistical component of how those minerals are transported to global markets and to other parts of Australia, into other parts of the manufacturing industry. We've also, in South Australia, there's also a nation-leading investment in renewable energy. So South Australia leads the nation in solar and wind energy production. And there are huge opportunities for renewable energy to power processing facilities. So if we're to establish this processing facilities in Australia, and particularly in South Australia, there are major opportunities using existing infrastructure that could be harnessed. And I'd refer you to my former colleague from the Centre for Future Worker, Dan Nahum's 2020 report, Powering Onwards, for a much broader look at how this can actually be transformative to our manufacturing sector and how there are huge opportunities to capture there. So on to the second building block, which is mobilising capital and developing supply chains. Fundamentally, Australian business and industry needs to decarbonise rapidly. And in large part, this needs to see capital investment away from fossil fuel industries and towards stronger innovative capability being nurtured amongst the small and medium-sized enterprises that make up the bulk of Australia's manufacturing sector, and helping those SMEs to develop renewable capabilities and work with renewable technologies. For decades with the automotive industry in Australia, it was SMEs that utilised the skilled and knowledgeable labour that served the operation of manufacturing in Australia. So key large anchor firms provided the initial spur of production and employment growth through domestic investments. And this was, of course, clearest when we had global automotive original equipment manufacturers like Holden, like Ford, like Mitsubishi, when they were operating in Australia. But more recently, many of the core capabilities of vehicle manufacturing have departed Australia, as we've seen. But what this does is leave a broader manufacturing sector that's even more dependent on SMEs for its continued activity and, in fact, its growth. And because major firms have dominated research and development and innovation activity, SMEs must be supported to enhance their capabilities, to strengthen supply chains and build connections with primary resource industries. And of course, facing climate change, this naturally means that we need to shift towards renewables. And as I mentioned, help SMEs develop capabilities in sustainable technologies and sustainable industries. And there is some good news here, because data on the motor vehicle and motor vehicle parts manufacturing industry has shown encouraging signs that what was often declared as the death of automotive manufacturing in Australia after 2017 was actually premature. So as of last year, there were more than 34,000 workers still employed in these businesses, and that's doubled the number of workers employed in the gas industry, which is at around 16,000. So for all of the talk about a gas-fired recovery, there are still twice as many workers working in auto parts manufacturing in Australia than there are in the gas industry. And so a future electric vehicle industry would build on the already existing activity of auto manufacturing supply chains. And plus, some of these businesses have already diversified into the manufacture of electric buses, trucks, and other vehicles. So there are a lot of really interesting business and industry activity coming up all around Australia, in Queensland, in Victoria, and in South Australia particularly. And in terms of South Australia's employment by business size, there were 64,020 people employed in manufacturing in South Australia in November 2021, according to the Labour Market Information Portal. And from South Australian Government Economic Insights, most of the job growth in South Australia at this time came from micro and small firms. And this is also the case in Australia, in fact. But in South Australia, small and micro firms contribute to exports much more than in Australia. So 34% of exports compared to 27% across the whole of Australia. They also contribute 55% to employment in South Australia compared to the Australian average, which is just 46%. So as I mentioned, SMEs are going to be a big part of any EV industry developments. And this again places South Australia at a very strong position to harness some of the SME activity that could go in the supply chains. Although there's no available data for South Australia's share of auto parts manufacturing SMEs, there are encouraging signs of SMEs' role in the economy. And the number of medium-sized enterprises, in fact, has remained relatively stable over the post-Holden period. Although a decline in small-sized enterprises has been seen, many auto manufacturing firms are likely to sit within the medium-sized category, so hopefully around 50 or more employees. Considering the fact that a lot of the tier one suppliers to the larger automotive industries have continued to operate and export into global markets most of all. So some growth amongst large firms could be an indication of medium-sized enterprises growing into large firms as well. And however, though, large firms don't contribute as much to South Australia's economic activity as the small firms do, as the figures previously mentioned show. But an aim of policy therefore should be to grow small firms into medium-sized firms that will be instrumental in transforming these existing supply chains for EV industries. And this is where the geography of supply chain developments is important. As I've mentioned already, South Australia's automotive industrial history of SMEs clustering around large suppliers and OEMs in automotive production, which are largely gone, still means that there's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of skills, a lot of capability to harness the supply chain opportunities if we are to commit to an industry policy that can revive manufacturing through electric vehicle production. As I've mentioned as well, the end of auto manufacturing in Australia has increased the reliance on SMEs, and this altogether places South Australia in a very strong position to see that there's opportunities to continue growing SMEs and contribute to larger supply chains nationally as well as globally. And I've mentioned just there in passing the idea that there are skills still existing in some of these geographical clusters of auto manufacturing, but there is a real imperative to rebuild skilled manufacturing labour. This, of course, would need to focus on the final assembly of electric vehicles and also the assembly of electric vehicle batteries. And so that's why I think it's very important to see that not only should we be making batteries in Australia, we should also be looking at the final assembly of electric vehicles themselves. Of course, we need to mobilise our vocational education and training sector to produce this skilled workforce to supply to what would become demanding manufacturing industries. But before we do that, we need to overcome current training and skills limitations and produce new training packages for electric vehicle manufacturing industries, and as well as the batteries. So they are two distinct categories of training. Basically, in the existing training packages in the vocational education and training sector, electric vehicles are still treated only as hybrid. So there's actually no dedicated skill set and a range of units dedicated to working with electric vehicles that aren't also classified as hybrid. So we can see that there's still the legacy of ICE production in Australia's auto supply chains, carrying forward and continuing to create lag in our ability to provide the skills that are needed for an EV-only manufacturing industry in Australia. Basically, because TAFE has been the driver of skills and workforce demand for those skilled workforces in manufacturing industries historically, it needs to also become the centerpiece of a skills transformation towards EVs. And this will also help to overcome some of the shortcomings that we currently have in training packages and put TAFE in the driver's seat of identifying the needs in local communities, as well as identifying the needs of local businesses that will benefit from local employment. South Australia as well has a big role to play here. If we look at Holden, for example, TAFE historically provided auto industry training packages in the north of Adelaide as well as the south of Adelaide. And there are growing strengths in sustainable industries such as the TAFE campus located at the Tonsley Innovation Precinct. So there are huge opportunities for an innovative approach to skills and training development. And advanced manufacturing firms, particularly at Tonsley, as well as in the south and the north of Adelaide's suburban area as well, can form the backbone of a pipeline that takes learners from education and training into work in those high-tech manufacturing industries. So this is all there, ripe for the picking. And as the theme is developing here, all we really need is a federal industry policy to connect all of these dots. And so, just checking my slide there. Yep, we've covered that. So the fourth building block rather is the role of government and other key institutions in EV industry developments. Fundamentally, the federal government must play an active coordinating role in the development of an EV industry policy for Australia. When governments don't take the leading role, private markets often fail to create the kinds of industrial development that are beneficial to society and the environment. Government can also create and shape markets for renewables-driven industrial developments, and this is becoming more and more important as we face a climate change crisis that doesn't pay attention to borders, basically. The South Australian government can support SME transitions into high-value manufacturing industries in national and global EV supply chains. But of course, even though state-based initiatives are really important, it's really important to emphasise the fact that a federal coordinating industry policy is going to be the major driver of any action at a national scale. And because I'm from the Carmichael Centre as well, no industry policy would be complete without industrial policy as an industrial democracy piece. So workers need to be involved in decision-making around industrial transformation. Leaving workers and their unions out of any industrial policy making limits the possibilities for a renewable future, especially when private actors will only make the kinds of investments to realise their profit motive. So community participation, including unions as well as local communities involved in skills development, involved in imagining what their communities will look like with new industries, is important to create an inclusive EV future and a future driven by EVs, that is. Shaping the EV-driven future depends on widespread grassroots community engagements, and EV ownership would ultimately be supplemented by an abundance of well-funded and sustainable public transport and zero-emissions transport options that further support the innovative possibilities of a broadening electric vehicle manufacturing industry. So this all points to the fact that an EV manufacturing industry in Australia is not just about cars. It's got to be about renewable technologies. It's got to be about new forms of transportation that mean that we are diversifying our application of new technologies and all targeted at adaptation to climate change, at reducing our emissions, decarbonising our economy, and responding to climate change in a sustainable way that maximises community inclusivity and the participation of all workers. So electric vehicles, to summarise that, must be part of a broader climate policy. The use of private electric vehicles is not the only solution, and we have to move beyond magic bullet solutions that, when scaled up, are ecologically unsustainable. So if we were to replace all ICEs, all internal combustion engine vehicles, with EVs, we would not address climate change sustainably. We would be heading towards ecological disaster, considering the energy consumption that's required to produce everything at that scale. And we need to diversify the way that we look at the problems we're facing, the way that we address those problems. So this is why I've suggested that Australia could become an exporter of applied renewable energy solutions. The goal here would be to utilise our abundance of renewable energy and our technological know-how to export not just highly advanced electric vehicles and EV products, but to export our knowledge of how to reimagine sustainable societies. From urban development through to our transport mix, to our energy grids and our community participation in these ventures. So this would mean South Australia becomes a key exporter of renewable industry knowledge, technology and expertise. So that would be South Australia's contribution to what Australia's economic complexity could be, broadly classified as being applied renewable energy solutions. So that is ultimately what we want to strive towards. And the biggest takeaway is that private EVs aren't going to be the magic bullet. We need to think about this as a whole of nation approach to climate change, and only an industry policy can achieve that. And so that's all I have on my presentation, but I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you for listening, and that's how you can get in touch with me and look at the work that we've been doing at the Carmichael Centre and the Centre for Future Work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. That was, I would like to call it a holistic presentation. I guess it's what you get when you look at how various aspects of the economy connect. And your starting point was complexity, economic complexity. And once you start mapping it out, and you see how one little change presupposes further developments, but also has subsequently opportunities emerging from it, you get a completely different picture of how industrial policy could and arguably should operate, and taking a view of the various dimensions of what's been happening. So that's been really, really good. As you were talking, I felt reminded of an article I came across in Bloomberg News just a couple of days ago, where a Chinese battery manufacturer has gone out to Indonesia to build a new complex which integrates the production of the battery, the sourcing of the resources, the battery itself, with a view to then connect also to the EV production line at the end. So that's where this is a kind of a joint venture that appears to be in the pipeline over there, and it's a good example that there are strategic businesses or businesses thinking strategically about how their own processes connect with others, and how they can integrate different aspects of and diversify their own industrial bases as a result of that. But that's businesses taking those steps. What we are talking about is what can governments do about that, and how do we as researchers need to think about industrial policy in the future. We've got a number of questions coming in already. They're actually in the chat, so I think rather than the Q&A. So I think everyone can read those questions, but I'll see them. But I'll read them out anyway. So the first one is from what I believe to be a colleague in the college, Tanya Lehman, who's asking whether we also need to rethink skill sets for vehicle repairs, mechanics, and even driving instructors. So it's the full range.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thanks for your question, Tanya. Absolutely. I mean, not only are EVs less complex than internal combustion engine vehicles, they have less parts overall. So that suggests a fundamental rethink of how we design training packages, units of competency for mechanics and repairers to work with EVs. And I also think that because, and this is where the discussion around the fourth industrial revolution, Industry 4.0 comes in as well, and this concept of servitization, the increasing automation and digitalization of what have traditionally been the more hands-on roles in manufacturing, meaning that machines are doing more of that. And although humans are still fundamental, don't get me wrong, but it's changing the job descriptions and therefore the skills and training required for repairers, for mechanics, for maintenance, and sort of transforming the labour market to an extent, which means that we need to transform those training packages as well. And that's going beyond just the initial idea that yes, EVs are very different from ICEs, and therefore we need to redesign and have entirely separate training packages, not just, as I mentioned in my presentation, only training packages that identify EVs as hybrid, as something that has both an ICE and a battery in it. So absolutely, yeah, we need to rethink root and branch. And one of the recommendations I make in my report is that there is a root and branch review of the training package system and how for EVs, that is, and how we can actually prepare the grounds for what could hopefully be a revival of production in Australia.
And Tanya said a follow-up question to that, whether it's I guess the question is whether as EV development, we're getting into sort of more complex field of actual use and the policy that comes with it, whether a move towards a national policy approach becomes easier. I guess it may become more urgent, would be my initial answer. Then it might not necessarily become easier, but what do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I agree with you, Andreas. I think perhaps not easier, perhaps urgent. I think, yeah, there is going to be a whole, just from the point of view of logistics, I think, and the way that freight is moved around Australia, our transport system and infrastructure, that's going to require massive investment from government and policy oversight and regulation to ensure that we have a entirely nationally encompassing approach to just that system alone. So that's probably the urgent part, and I think that's I see Tanya's question about automated EVs, and I think that's still some time off. Personally, I don't think that driverless vehicles are going to become quite as widespread as our dependence on transport and logistics that still, includes drivers and humans in the supply chains, and therefore actually understanding, a very uniform approach to skills and training, maintenance of EVs is essential to ensure that becomes sustainable and transforms in a very uniform way.
The next question immediately that makes immediate sense to me is, how are we going to get there? I mean, how do you? All this requires political leadership. How can we improve awareness of that? I don't know whether it's part of your research. You had an opportunity to talk to the key policymakers in this area at federal level or state level, and what if you did? I mean, what's been your impression there? About the level of awareness and readiness to actually take initiative and develop something that is much more strategic than we currently have.
And unfortunately, I don't think there's an enormous amount of appetite in the current federal government. The opposition has certainly has an EV industry policy. It could be more ambitious, I think, but it does recognise the need to capture the existing capabilities we have and prevent, the loss of them, as we have been since the closure of Holden, particularly, and reverse that. I think they're also aware of the need to encourage consumer uptake, but also to ensure that we have the skills locally to maintain and repair, and that all, I think they aren't going to the extent of completely rebuilding our auto industry, but as I mentioned in my presentation, we already do have trucks, buses in the EV manufacturing space in Australia, and I think that there's a really big focus on ensuring that they continue to be export competitive, and to ensure that there's adequate attention in policy to those areas. I think that it's very difficult to separate the need for an EV industry policy from climate change. And I think that's what the next government should be doing is understanding that climate change is about transforming our manufacturing sector, particularly linking it to our critical minerals, and seeing it as a overarching strategic imperative to prepare our economy for the next pandemic, the next global crisis that we will inevitably face, and ensure that it becomes an anchor point for creating the resilience that we need across those supply chains and in all of our manufacturing industries. So I guess I don't see it yet. I don't think it's fully fledged. It's not out there. But I have been speaking to the Electric Vehicles Council, and they're very supportive of this idea, of my recommendations. And in fact, one of their primary recommendations to the government, as well as the current federal opposition, was to have an EV industry commission first off the bat. So we need to have an EV industry commission that involves stakeholders from government, industry, from the unions, from the community, from the energy sector, and identify what is required to massively decarbonize it rapidly, and how that can become a pivot point for EV manufacturing transformations. So there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of support, and as you mentioned as well, that a lot of businesses are already seeing that they can diversify their capabilities, and they can link to global supply chains. Many companies in Australia are already seeing those opportunities, and so we have mining industries they know that they have lithium that can be processed in Australia, and there's no supply chains developed. And the major reason for that being that the Australian government hasn't provided the building blocks for that. So it is really going to take a holistic approach to it. It's going to need to see that it's not just about reviving manufacturing in Australia, it's about transforming our minerals industries to ensure that we process it here, not overseas, and capture all of that value add.
One of you mentioned the mining companies, and these are big conglomerates that have the resources or potentially have the resources to diversify their own operation. But as you pointed out in your presentation, certainly the South Australian economy is largely an SME economy, and I was sort of wondering whether you presented it as an opportunity. It's a strong baseline that we have, but it's also a coordination problem that I see. If you have many small businesses, it sort of emphasizes the need for some kind of direction, leadership, whatever you want to call it, because otherwise, where would they know where to go and what to do unless they have a strong corporate body that can take on that role? And I'm not sure we have this at the minute. To what extent do you see scope for state governments to influence where we're headed?
I think that state governments are in a very difficult position to gain any traction in the absence of a federal policy. I think that the federal government needs to be the coordinating and directing stakeholder. State governments, I think, can make some headway, but as we've seen as well, there's really only been an appetite amongst state governments to enact consumer policies for EVs. I think that perhaps the word you use for mining industry stakeholders as conglomerates suggests that their capital power and the political power is far too enormous for any single state government to take on, and that's why we need a federal government to direct and coordinate. And I think a really great example of how they can do that and how they can work, how a federal government can work both with the mining industry stakeholders and as well as state governments, is by something as simple as a value-adding tax to any commodity exports of rare earth and critical minerals for EV batteries is exported without first working with federal and state governments to identify supply chain opportunities and direct some of their profits into the collaborative development of those supply chains. So actually helping the federal government, helping both mining industries, for example, see that there are opportunities to invest in Australia, and helping state governments with the political capital and backing to grease the wheels a bit, sweeten the deal, ensure that they have everything they need in terms of access to power. In some ways, kind of a modern day take on what Tom Playford did in South Australia in the 1930s. Offer access to infrastructure, to cheap energy. Energy is not so much an issue today because energy is relatively cheap. But the idea would be to say that, well, for example, South Australia has near 100% renewable energy penetration. Why don't you come and capitalise on the fact that we can help you set that up and lower your energy costs and connect you to all the other infrastructure that's essential to getting your products to market. We already have the TAFEs invested locally, so there's a huge state role to be played in ensuring that TAFEs have the education and training in place to provide the workers. And the states can also become large procurement sources. So if states are leading by example, I think that's probably the largest pivot point. But that as well, I think, takes federal government to coordinate its own procurement strategy to electrify its fleets and set examples for state and local governments as well. So it's this is where the policy becomes far more complex, and where what we first need, I guess, is beyond the Industry Commission, is a department within the federal government that is dedicated to understanding how this is going to work and how all of its moving parts are going to put this into practice. And I'm encouraged by the fact that my former colleague Dan Nahum, who has gone back to the Australian Public Service, is working on these very issues. You were talking there about a very Mariana Mazzucato mission-oriented industry policy. And that's exactly what he's going to do in the federal government. So there are encouraging signs that there is a unit within the government looking at how we tackle these complex problems. And so what I'd like to see is it becomes specifically addressed towards EVs in some way or another.
Great. Look, there's hope, therefore. You mentioned just now public procurement, and I was hoping you would mention that, because that clearly is an opportunity. Also, as we go down the geographical scale from state level to council level, there is, again, it's largely uncoordinated potential to use public procurement to make a difference. But then, of course, if everyone did that, I guess you could run into supply chain challenges, because I'm just imagining you said that you already have an electric vehicle bus manufacturing. If you have too much of that or demand for that, this supply wouldn't be here. And which relates to one of the questions that has come in, which is how can you encourage consumer uptake when you can't get hold of an EV in Australia unless you can wait for 6 months or import a used one at huge expense. So yes, the stats that I mentioned earlier about sort of around 1.5% of new vehicle registration. So that's light vehicle registration in Australia being EVs compared to 10% in Europe, etc. To what extent is this lack of consumer demand because we're not interested, or is it lack of consumer demand because the obstacles to use are just too great at this point in time? And what can be done about that?
Yeah, I think more towards the latter, that the obstacles are too great. But again, I don't think that that's anything other than a lack of any strategic foresight from the federal government. Overwhelmingly, Australians are interested in not just manufacturing, but the manufacturing of electric vehicles in Australia and private ownership. So, and people want to use electric cars and other electric vehicles. They want to decarbonise our transport infrastructure. They want to see renewable energy drive all of our modes of transport. And the federal government continues to make it incredibly difficult for a larger share of EVs to reach consumers in Australia. You mentioned very early on, the emissions targets that Europe has. Norway, for example, has an emissions target that will ensure that all electric vehicles, only electric vehicles, are sold in Norway from 2030. Australia doesn't have anything like that, and that discourages global auto manufacturers from bringing even their highest standards emissions vehicles to Australian markets. And that would be just straight away, that would be a very simple way of ensuring that future export to Australia from Volkswagen, from Toyota, from Mitsubishi, their highest standards ICE vehicles. And that creates a point at which we can, not only will they realise the demand for high quality, sustainable vehicles, they will see that Australians want electric vehicles and have for a long time wanted electric vehicles, particularly as the share of EVs in that mix increases as they become more affordable. So as long as governments as well at state level continue to offer subsidies and programs that make electric vehicles affordable, those pieces I think can work in unison. Government setting the emission standards, which are absent at the moment, as I mentioned, and ensuring that we are saying to the rest of the world, the auto manufacturers, that we're not going to be a dumping ground anymore, where we're going to take the best vehicles you have to offer, and that will eventually translate to EVs. And there's an awareness piece there, I think, as well, that the more EVs on the road, the more access to EV information and knowledge amongst consumers. This is all market information, and until we actually have a federal government seeing the opportunity to help provide EVs to the Australian auto market, that's also going to be a challenge. That Australians just simply don't realise the benefits, and it's already been proven as well that regionally electric vehicles, in the next 5 or 6 years, perhaps 500-kilometre range will be the standard, and that will allow more and more Australians to get away for the weekends and to go bush. And it also suggests that there's going to be demand for infrastructure investment in regions and potentially even remote. Again, this all feeds into the idea that we can become a nation that has, the most unique conditions to demonstrate what applied renewable energy solutions look like in the driest continent in the world. This is how we do it. It's just that there are all of those opportunities that are being captured because there's no mission, there's no imperative, and no direction setting at the federal level to see that these are opportunities rather than challenges.
Once again, it's important to see the connections. A little step here can have a ripple effect somewhere else. Look, Mark, and everyone, our time's up. Thank you very much for everyone for their questions, for everyone for attending. and to Mark, of course, for his presentation and his ability to give us great answers to sometimes some of the rather tough questions. We'll be back next month with our fourth installment of the seminar series. You will be receiving further details about this in the near future. So thank you very much for today, and I hope to see you all again next month. Bye.
Thank you.